The horror I experienced in that room transcended time, space, and reason. I will never forget those words. Zach Handley reached out to me 2 months ago from a throwaway email address claiming to be the sole victim of Dr. Faust's horrific study of 2014. This is an experiment you have never heard of, and probably never would have if it wasn't for Zach's bravery and willingness to seek me out. It was around 9 AM when I arrived at the doorstep of Zach's small town home. I immediately noticed the camera mounted to an awning and several security signs staked along the walkway. I knocked and waited for a few moments as the dull humming of a security camera adjusted. The sound of several locks unbolting soon followed. The door creaked open a few inches, and I recited the password that Zach and I had discussed over email. After a moment of hesitation, Zach invited me into the darkness of his small home. I observed my surroundings and quickly learned that he was a recluse. The small living space was cluttered with empty takeout containers, beer cans, and miscellaneous possessions. The air was pungent with the smell of stale garbage and burnt weed. Despite having a bedroom, Zach's bed had been moved to the center of the living room. Even stranger, all of the internal doors had been taken off of their hinges. As I sat on the couch, Zach plopped down on the edge of his mattress. He was thin, very thin. His pale skin seemed to glow in the darkness of his living space, contrasted only by shadows and the dark circles that painted his green eyes. Zach's face was unshaven, and his shaggy hair hung well past his shoulders. I cleared the paper bags from my cushion and placed my recorder on the coffee table before speaking. As you already know, my name is John. I don't want you to feel intimidated by the recorder. I simply use it as a tool for compiling my personal notes. We can edit out anything you do not like when we're finished. Zach looked down to grab a glass pipe from the table and began to pack it with cannabis. It's all good, man. I trust you. I've read your other cases and stuff. I know you help people, like me. I attempted to smile with sympathy. I like to think I can provide victims with a sense of closure and help those who have unexpectedly dealt with traumatic and unexplainable experiences. I clicked on the recorder as Zach placed the pipe to his lips and ignited his lighter. We can begin whenever you're ready. Zach exhaled the smoke and extended his arm to offer. I declined. Where should I, start? He asked. The air conditioning kicked on, and I noticed Zach flinch before I responded. We can start wherever you like. Why don't you tell me what led you to being involved with Dr. Faust's study? Zach took another hit. Well, I went to university from 2010 to 2014. I was doing alright in my classes, except for abnormal psych. I thought it would be an easy A, but the professor was tough, and she docked my grade every time I missed class. What was the professor's name? I asked. Kimball or Campbell, something like that. I jotted down Kimball/Campbell in my notebook. Do you think she had anything to do with what happened to you? Zach shook his head. No, not at all. I leaned in. How did you become associated with Dr. Faust? Zach's leg began to move up and down with anxiety as he spoke. Like I said, I wasn't doing well in class. The School of Psychology offered extra credit for any student willing to do studies grad students put together. All you had to do was check the bulletin board and show up. Dude, I did as many as I could. I scribbled in my notepad as I responded. What kind of studies were they? Zach took another hit from his pipe. They were pretty goddamn unoriginal, to be honest. Usually some sort of rendition of Pavlov, Schrodinger, or Milgram. Some were pretty cool though. especially the ones where you got drunk and they asked you questions to see how long it would take for you to mess up. I couldn't help but laugh. So Zach, you did all of these studies, but you were still failing the class? He nodded. Like I said, Kimball or Campbell or whatever was strict. I still needed about 50 overall points to be okay, and most studies offered between 5 and 10. I was running out of time. Zach sighed and looked down. It was Friday after class when I found a letter at my doorstep. It had the university logo on it and everything. Looked super legit. It was the letter from Dr. Faust. I leaned in with interest. What did it say? Zach's leg fidgeted furiously. Something along the lines of, "The psychology department is very pleased with your frequent participation. Dr. Faust cordially invites you to an exclusive study that will guarantee a full letter grade increase for this semester." Zach's eyes began to twitch. It went on to tell me that my involvement must be confidential, as the study was per invite only. I didn't even question it. "Where did the letter tell you to go?" I asked. Zach stared into my eyes. "The basement level of DiMarco Hall, room B7. I'll never forget that room, John, and that's why the police haven't taken me seriously. There is no basement at DiMarco Hall, and no room B7, but I swear to God, there was on that day." Zach turned and wiped the tears that were beginning to well in his eyes. "I remember hitting the button on the old elevator and everything. Lower level, room B7 was at the end of the hall." I quickly scribbled in my notepad and looked back up at him and asked, "What did the room look like?" Zach looked around nervously and lowered his voice as if he was in fear of being overheard. It looked normal, just like any other basement classroom. White brick walls and tile floors. I was the only person there. The room was empty except for a chair, small table, and an old computer in the middle of the room. The table had a note in it that said, "Zach, please click the mouse to begin the study." "Were you concerned at this point?" I asked. Zach was looking back at the floor. "Not at all. Not until the test began. I clicked the mouse and the computer lit up. The screen said, 'Find the mistakes in these photos as quickly as you can.' I'd done this kind of test before. Kind of like that photo hunt game. The first photo showed the night sky, but there were 2 moons. I clicked on one of the moons, and it showed the next picture. This one was of a bowl of fruit, but the pear was red instead of green. I clicked to the pear and then it went to the next picture." His eyes welled up again, and he choked on his words. "What was the next picture, Zach?" I asked. "It's okay." "No, it wasn't okay. The next photo was of my family on vacation at Disney World, outside of the Magic Kingdom. Me, my mom and dad, and my little brother, Thomas." Tears were streaming down his face. "You know what was wrong with the photo, John?" I shook my head. "Thomas, my little brother, he wasn't on that trip. That was the vacation we took 2 years after he died, back when we tried to remain a normal family. But there he was in the photo, standing right next to me, with the biggest smile you've ever seen." My stomach felt uneasy as Zach continued. "I got up and backed away from the computer. My mind was racing. I felt sick, confused, and I was furious. I went to the door and it wouldn't budge. I yelled and kicked it as hard as I could. Nothing. I tried my cell phone, but it was useless. No signal at all in the place. Not only that, but my phone wouldn't even respond. It was completely frozen. I went back to the computer to see if it had any internet access. The photo was still up with Thomas, staring at me with that huge smile. I couldn't get it off that screen. As much as I didn't want to admit it, I had to continue. I moved the mouse to click on Thomas and nearly puked. His skin had begun to turn grey in the photo and his eyes black, as if he was rotting. The smile on his face grew larger. I clicked on him, and it went on to the next picture. Zach buried his face in his hands as he continued. The next showed a photo of my father's funeral. He took his own life a few years after losing Thomas. I felt my own eyes tearing up. "I'm so sorry, Zach." He ignored my sympathy and continued. Everyone was standing in black as I lowered his casket into the ground. It looked like the photo had been taken from the nearby woods and zoomed in. I lost it at this point. I picked up the computer and smashed it on the ground. I've never been so mad in my entire life. I turned around to go back to the door. Zach paused. This is where no one believes me. The door wasn't there. It was just more white brick wall. I was trapped. My head started to spin. My heart was beating out of my chest. I turned back around, and there was the computer, back on the table in one piece, with the funeral image back on the screen. At this point, my brain tried to comprehend the situation. I thought that I was having a super realistic dream or something. I started slapping my face to try and wake up, but I never did. I was losing it. I sat against the wall of the classroom for probably 2 or 3 hours, trying to get a grip on reality. Eventually, I submitted to the voice in the back of my head. I had to finish the test. Zach sighed and continued. I went back to the photo to see what was wrong, so I could click it and continue. I looked at all of the people, dressed in black and standing around the grave. I saw so many familiar faces, family and friends. After a few moments, I saw it. I was ashamed I hadn't noticed it. It was my own face. My face in the photo. I was laughing hysterically, looking at the casket. I felt like I was going to puke again. I can swear to you that nobody laughed that day. I put the mouse over my face to click, and just before I did, it moved and stared directly at me through the screen. Tears were streaming down his cheek again. The moment I clicked, all of the lights went out in the room. I heard the floor creak and felt something behind me. I was too scared to move. It was like I was paralyzed. I just wanted it to be over. For a second, I felt cold air breathing down my neck. Zach excused himself to wipe his eyes and nose. What happened then? I asked. The lights came back on, but the room had changed, he whispered. I looked at him, curiously. Changed? How? Zach continued. Like, completely changed. It wasn't the same room anymore. More like a hallway, but really narrow. Too narrow. I've never done well with tight spaces. I was still in the chair, but the computer and table were gone. I realized then that I wasn't alone. The hallway smelled like death and rot. It was so bad I choked on it. The light behind me was disappearing, like the shadows and smells were creeping towards me. There was something in that darkness, John. I heard its wet, crackling footsteps on the floor. I had no choice but to move forward. I started to run. The hallway twisted and turned like a maze and became narrower as I pushed on. I've come to the realization that I was being treated like a lab rat, but instead of searching for a reward, I was avoiding a punishment. Eventually, the space was too narrow. The footsteps behind me grew louder. The only choice I had was to push through the narrow gap towards the cool air. I inched forward with all of my strength and tried to ignore the pain and eventually breached through. The space was just large enough, like it had been built for me. Whatever that thing was behind me sunk its finger into my leg before I made it to the room on the other side of the wall. What was on the other side? I asked. Zach continued. It was a large sewer line on the edge of campus. I ended up finding a ladder and climbed out. You know the rest. I jotted a few notes. And what of the investigation and Dr. Faust? Zach looked me in the eyes. The only record of a Dr. Faust was in 1919. He was fired and arrested when police discovered a makeshift lab under his home that he was using to torture students. He died in prison. There wasn't much of an investigation. I lost the original letter, and there's no evidence of any basement in DiMarco Hall. The only thing they can't figure out was the timing. What do you mean? I asked. My roommate reported me missing pretty quickly. 3 weeks had passed by the time I climbed out of that sewer. I hadn't eaten, drank, or slept. The horror I experienced in that room transcended time, space, and reason. Zach looked back down to the floor. I'd like to end the interview now. And so I did. Zach and I parted ways. I listened to our conversation during my drive home. By the end, I was skeptical of his entire story. That was, until I went to walk to my own front door. I hadn't given Zach or the university my information. But, sitting on my doorstep, was a letter from Dr. Faust inviting me to participate in his next study.